Welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our writers, Lanta Davis, who wrote a piece for us recently called Bone Chapels and Their Strange Art. So we will be talking about crypts and skeletons and art. Before we dive into the article, Lanta, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am a professor at Indiana Wesleyan University. I work for the John Wesley Honors College, where I get to teach cool classes that literally have titles: What is Beauty? Rhetoric and the Sacramental Imagination. We have other classes like What is Truth? What is the Good Life? I really get to enjoy asking some of these questions with students. I'm also the author of a book that came out this past July called Becoming by Beholding, The Power of the Imagination in Spiritual Formation. So I really love looking at arts and thinking about stories and how they just shape who we are and how we see the world.
Oh, super cool. Um, well, that all makes sense given this really cool article that you wrote for us. You describe in the beginning your visit to a crypt in Rome, the Capuchin Crypt, the Capuchin Crypt. I don't know. I looked it up and I cannot decide how it should be pronounced. But you visited this place with bone chapels, and you describe them a bit in the piece. But could you tell us a little bit more about just what it was like to walk through those chapels? What visually struck you about the space?
Yeah, it really does feel like walking through a tunnel of death. So right at the beginning, there's a sign that forewarns you and says, "What you are, we once were. What we are, you soon will be." So it's this kind of ominous entrance to it and an invitation to meditate on the brevity of life. And as soon as you walk into the doors, then you're greeted by this image of death that's made out of bones and it's hanging on the ceiling and he has his scales and his scythe and he's ready to cut you down. And there's also skeletons dressed up like the monks, so they actually have the robes on and they have garlands made out of bones. There's flowers made out of bones. The whole place, every single decoration is formed out of bones, and it's a really odd feeling because it's eerie and honestly felt kind of like gross in a way, because this is one of my first experiences and encounters with something like that. But it's also so creative, and being able to recognize the individual pieces that formed these bigger artworks is really powerful. And I started to recognize, once I adjusted to what I was seeing and what I was doing, there was butterfly wings that were happening and hourglasses with wings. And it was just a very powerful meditation on helping us confront our own impending death so that we can focus on the eternal. And also, I think meditating on how to behold death in such a way that we can start to recognize death as not only the enemy, but actually potentially something beautiful that is our transition into the eternal life. And so it's taking these dead bones of the monastic brothers. So there's like 4,000, I think, monastic brothers whose bones make up these six rooms. So it's just packed with bones. Um, to help us think about how we might start to see death as this beautiful transition and entryway into eternity and not just something to fear and be horrified by.
You describe in the article some resonance between the bone chapels, a very abnormal place, and the practice of the Eucharist, which for many Christians is extremely common and activity to take part in. Could you tell us a little more about the connections you see between these two things?
Yeah, so in the crypt, you walk through four rooms full of bones, and they even have names like the Crypt of Femurs and the Crypt of Skulls. And then you get to the fourth room, which is, or sorry, the fifth room, which is actually the Eucharist room. So there's an altar there, and it's actually free of bones. So on the one hand, you think, okay, this is like actually the sacred space, and so therefore they don't have bones. But what's fascinating is that, at least traditionally, all Eucharistic tables have bones in them. The altar had to be consecrated with the bones of saints or martyrs inside of them, as a reminder of our call to die with Christ so that we ought to resurrect with Christ. And so it does seem commonplace to us today to have, the elements and to eat the body and blood, and maybe not register that we're eating the body and drinking the blood. So it does feel like this very again, eerie thing that isn't that much different than walking through the bone chapels, that is just as disorienting, just as strange. But it's really powerful too to think about that tradition and to remember too that Christians were even accused of something like cannibalism by the Romans because they heard about this practice of eating the body and thought that's weird. Like, what are these Christians doing? And so, yes, it might be commonplace to us today, but there is that powerful act and that reminder that if we want to resurrect with Christ, we can't skip over the death, that Christ himself dies, and we too are called to die with him so that we can resurrect with him. And so the Eucharist is this powerful reminder that we need to participate in that death in order to get to the resurrection. And we can't, unfortunately, just skip ahead through that process. And so to actually eat death, I think, is a really important way for us to think about how we need to face it, confront it, to actually be so comfortable with it, it like enters into our bodies so that we remember the inevitable end of our bodies, and also their resurrection and the miracle and the gratitude that we feel for the fact that these bodies will die but will be resurrected with Christ.
Wow, thank you. Speaking of thinking about death and resurrection, near the end of the piece, you write quite a bit about your mother, and thank you for being vulnerable in this essay. Um, you say that when you think of dead bodies, like at this point, you think of hers, and and yet this whole experience of visiting these bone chapels seems to have changed some of the ways you think about death and resurrection. So I was curious if this has changed kind of your approach as a person when you have to face loss and grief.
Mhm.
Has some of this new thinking about death and resurrection been relevant as you navigate those realities?
Yeah, so I visited the Bone Chapel probably 2 years before my mother died, and it didn't really strike me until afterwards how much it had actually helped prepare me for that reality. Um, in part because I had such a fear of death. And it feels like something we oftentimes hide away. We tend to, put grass over or like even fake turf around the burial mound so we don't see the raw earth. We have flowers everywhere. And I understand that there's a sense of trying to make it beautiful, but also there's a kind of escapism, I think, to how we oftentimes treat death. I would never, ever have wanted to touch a dead body. And even just looking at caskets or the whole process of visiting was just terrifying to me. And so being in the bone chapels, I realized helped me be not exactly comfortable with the death, but at least more willing to confront it, more willing to understand the body is not something suddenly foreign and scary and terrifying, but still very much beloved and beautiful and worth affirming. And so, especially as I you know, had to confront the reality of my mother's body all of a sudden in this casket where she looked like herself but not quite like herself was just a really important reminder that death is something that definitely seems scary and grief is a whole process and a kind of abyss that we go through, but also that on the other side of this is a reminder that like that butterfly made out of bones in the Capuchin Crypt, it's a reminder of it as a kind of transition, as a resurrection, as a process. And so it's really beautiful and heartening for me to look at my mother's hands and to know that the Christian beliefs tell us to affirm the resurrection of the body and that it's not just our spirit that's risen again, but that bodies actually kind of bust out of the gravesite, that they break through the tomb, and that we follow Christ in breaking open that slab and living again in the body. And so it was really heartening for me to think about that this body that I hugged and loved and so understood my mother as just being a part of her body, that that wasn't the end there, but actually a kind of transition. See, I'm gonna cry. This is why I have to do the second time. Um, that there's a kind of beautiful gratitude, I think, in facing the reality of skulls and bones that help us actually remember the passage in Ezekiel that talks about them coming to life again, that there's actually this gathering and a resurrection and the dry bones will become one. And I think that the Capuchin Crypt just helped me really think about that death is certainly part of the story and we need to sit and rest and reckon with it. but also that resurrection helps us know that it isn't the final end to the story. And so that yes, our bodies will become bones, but also those bones will become bodies again that will resurrect. And I think that's just such a beautiful way to help us navigate loss and grief and all the difficulties that come with confronting death in its bare reality.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us and for reminding us that it is okay to cry on YouTube and in all of life. Um, Really appreciate you sharing with us today. For anyone out there who didn't get a chance to read Lanta's article, the link to it will be in the video description below, along with the link to her website where you can check out a lot of her other writings. Thanks so much for chatting today, Lanta.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it.